Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to our ritual night talk for October 26th, 2021. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these ritual night events, presented under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So tonight, I am going to talk about the subject of offerings. And in that context, I've included the donation link. So if you enjoy this video, you can make an offering to Leaping Laughter OTO by means of the donation link included in this video. And I had floated the idea, thinking it over, about talking about sacrifices and making that the title. But you know what? That would have resulted in this video being swarmed by all kinds of people being like, oh yeah, see, it's the magicians, they do sacrifices, blah, blah, blah. Because there's this stupid pop culture conspiracy nonsense about it. And anyway, the concept of sacrifice is actually kind of a misnomer in a number of different ways. Really, what we're talking about is offerings. That is, you do a magical operation with the spirit and you make some kind of an offering to that spirit to help it, help fortify it, to nourish it, and thank it for its help in what you're trying to do. And this is fundamentally different from this movie idea of sacrifice in at least one key way. Okay. Human brain does this thing called the just world assumption. It's known in psychology. Okay. And the idea is that people tend to kind of look at the world from the standpoint of, oh, well, the world is basically fair. Okay. And so the idea how this falls into offerings and or sacrifices is the idea that, oh, well, if I offer something to a spirit that is of really, really high value to me, then what's going to happen is that spirit's going to do better work for me. Okay. And maybe if you think that through for a minute, you see the logical flaw with it, but I'll spell it out in case you don't. This is essentially what the issue is. What you need to offer a spirit is something that the spirit values. Spirits are independent entities, okay? And therefore, what you value, something that you are giving to the spirit, really doesn't have anything to do with how effective the magical operation will be. And I do hear this repeated sometimes in occult discussions that, well, yeah, you got to sacrifice something that's really valuable to you and then you'll get, well, no, that isn't actually true. Okay. And I will say I have experimented over the years with making different kinds of offerings to spirits of greater or lesser value and stuff like this. And no, the value to you doesn't really have anything to do with it because the spirit is an independent entity, because it's an independent intelligence. Well, you need to offer it something that it wants. Okay. So let me give you an example of this. Okay. So most spirits like alcohol. Okay. You could take, some kind of alcohol, pour it out to spirit. That usually works just fine. And most spirits like it. Most spirits will work with it well. Now, you don't need to pour out a huge amount of alcohol for the spirit. You don't necessarily even need to pour out expensive alcohol for the spirit. The key is what the spirit likes, not what it costs, not how hard it was to get, not any of that stuff. Those things are assumptions that our brain tends to put onto things. And if we want to be really effective magicians, one of the keys is to understand that this is sort of like between the spirit world and our world, which they're really the same world, but spirit form and human form. Okay. What's going on when you're making an offering is it's a sort of arbitrage, okay, in the following way. So in the financial world, arbitrage is the idea of your buying something at a low price in one place and then you're selling it someplace else at a much higher price. You don't actually create value through arbitrage. It's more a question of you're basically just making money. Okay. So, things like currency trading. Okay. Well, this currency is worth this. So you buy a bunch of it and then it goes up and then you sell it once the market goes up. Or you buy a product in one place where it's very cheap and then you resell it someplace where it's very expensive. That is called arbitrage. And how this works in the context of magic is that you could take alcohol, okay, that is not particularly expensive, not anything that is that hard to get a hold of, but you can pour that out to a spirit and the spirit will really like it. It doesn't matter that, you didn't spend a lot of money on it. It doesn't matter that you put yourself out. Basically, you can get more work out of the spirit with a relatively small amount of something not very expensive, just because the spirit likes it. Okay. And that is one of the keys to using offerings effectively as a magician. Now, the whole sacrifice idea, on the other hand, is like, well, we should like sacrifice humans because that's like the ultimate sacrifice. Nope. Just stop. That's a bunch of conspiracy crap. That's not something magicians do. Where the idea came from, I am going to talk about this a little bit, is that in the late 1960s, when you had people like Anton LaVey getting in the press and talking about Satanism and stuff like that, there were porn producers who made satanic porno films. Okay. I have an article about this on the blog, and maybe I should have included it in the description, but I don't necessarily want it coming up in the search either. So maybe I'll add a link to that article in the comments. And no, the whole idea of, pop culture Satanists, okay, that comes, that, that you see in, various, conspiracy theory stuff today. When you ask, fundamentalist Christians what they think Satanists do and what they think occultists do, all this stuff came out of porn movies in the early 1970s that were based around the idea of Satanism. It has no bearing on anything real. Okay. And so to understand that, I mean, you have to realize that there are traditions that do, for example, make use of animal sacrifices, blood sacrifices, and so forth. And some spirits do like blood offerings. I mean, that is a true thing. So there are some spirits that if you make an offering of blood to them, that they'll really like that. But in my opinion, okay, as a modern magician, we have access to all these different spirits and all these different traditions and so on. And if you've got a spirit that wants you to, sacrifice an animal or offer blood or something like that, it's relatively easy to find another spirit with similar powers who maybe, will just take your booze instead. You know what I mean? It's like, alcohol is easy to come by. It's very generic. It usually works. Okay. So, trying to track down, this idea that's a spirit that wants something like really exotic as an offering, well, that's not necessarily going to get you a more powerful spirit. In fact, a spirit with an offering it likes, that is, of about the same class and whatever system, is about as powerful. And so, work with the spirits that want the offerings that you're willing to give, right? I mean, that seems to me to not be very complicated. But again, people who do magic get this idea that people in magic get this idea that, there again, this just world stuff gets mixed in, and they think that, it's like more about, being a badass than working with the technology. And I would say that being a badass is really pointless. It's like, okay, you are willing to sacrifice an animal to make an offering to a spirit where, maybe I, as a magician, I'm probably not going to do that. Well, I mean, you're maybe more badass than me, but it's like, do you get better results than me? Because I'm betting that, somebody like that probably doesn't. And also, they're putting in a lot more work to get those results than I am. And, as in computer programming, laziness is not always a disadvantage in magic. Sometimes it can be a big advantage. I've made comments about this before. Crowley had this talk about how the Golden Dawn talked about the minimum amount of work required. And Crowley thought that was terrible because you shouldn't be telling people what the minimum amount of work is. You should be, working them harder than that. And so it's true in the context of you need to be diligent about your daily practice. I mean, if I, tell people, oh yeah, you can do your daily practice a couple times a week. Well, sometimes you actually can get away with that, but you really shouldn't, because what'll happen is it'll set up a bad habit and so on. That is, if that's what you did, okay, well, be more diligent next time. There is a sacrifice in the sense of the discipline of keeping to your practices day in and day out, and also commitments that you make to a spirit, regarding offerings or other things, you should make the utmost effort to keep those commitments. But you should also be careful about what you commit. Don't commit something that is some huge thing, right? That, you probably aren't going to be able to do. Because in reality, if you make a small commitment, if you do this, I will pour out some, cognac mentioned in the comments. I can pour out some cognac for you. Okay. Or, if you do this, I will do some huge, big gesture kind of thing. Well, what's going to happen is the big gesture, if it's hard to do, you're going to be less likely to do it. Whereas pouring out the cognac, yeah, you could totally do that. And what's going to happen is that keeping that commitment in a magical sense, in a coherent sense, versus, promising something big and not delivering, that is far inferior. You're not going to get the same result from that because you didn't keep to your commitment. And so make commitments and promises that you can keep to. Make offerings that you can afford, and so on. You want to work that way with stuff that's going on. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about one of the pieces of text in Thelema that people bring up, and they have this idea that, oh, see, this proves that Thelemites, do blood sacrifices and all this kind of stuff. And that is the chapter from Magic and Theory and Practice called On the Bloody Sacrifice. Okay. And Aleister Crowley wrote this when he was, putting together, his idea for book 4, which, one of the sections of book 4 was then published as Magic and Theory and Practice. And so he talks about how, sacrifice, a proper sacrifice, is a male child, and, blood for this and blood for that. And he's talking about all this stuff that is essentially a veiled reference to sex magic. He even says at the end of it, he says, anybody who misunderstands this chapter is likely to get into a lot of trouble. So he's winking at the audience. And what was going on at that time is a context that's kind of important to understand. Okay, so at the time, there were obscenity laws, okay, not just in the United States, all over the world. And so if you wrote something that was about sexuality, it was likely to get censored. And so instead, Crowley thought it was hilarious to write this chapter on, we'll talk about the bloody sacrifice. So we're really talking about sex magic, and sacrificing a child is masturbation, and stuff like this. Okay, and he wrote this, and what was hilarious about it was that he's writing, if you read it literally, he's writing about like killing people, right? But that goes through. That's fine. The obscenities. Oh, but yeah, don't you dare talk about sex. And that was basically the joke. Okay. Now, unfortunately, that has been misused. It's been misused a number of times, especially by the courts during the satanic ritual abuse scare in the late 1980s, early 1990s. If you watch the HBO documentary Paradise Lost on the West Memphis 3, that's Damien Echols' case, and 2 other defendants. Damien Echols is now an occult author and has published a few books. And at the time, he was interested in stuff like magic. And there is a scene of the prosecutor sitting there saying that, okay, so, and the case was, so there was a young boy who was murdered, and basically Echols and 2 of his friends were basically like the town weirdos. And the police brought in one of the friends, and they forced a confession that was just ridiculous. And then that got turned around into the trial. And you've got to see into this prosecutor saying, well, you see here, Aleister Crowley writes this, in the bloody sacrifice, you sacrificed a child and that and that. And you're interested in Aleister Crowley, so that's why you did it. Okay. And, if that were a story from the Bible, and the Bible has lots of stories about killing people, okay, nobody would have taken it remotely seriously. But because it's from Aleister Crowley and it's occultism, okay, well, they were found guilty. And so that's an example of how, Crowley going kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, well, I did some real harm there. And so that's something that you need to be aware of. Especially since these ideas, from the Satanic Panic, they never really completely went away. I mean, so they were discredited by the FBI in the early 90s. And, there was a little bit of a lull, as you went, you got into like the late 90s, early 2000s and stuff. But then, in the last 5 years, you've seen stuff like this QAnon conspiracy looping back around and pulling in all the same ideas. And it's like the stuff doesn't really leave us. And so it's good to understand that about where Crowley was coming from with his bloody sacrificing. When you've got people out there who are trying to accuse us of actually sacrificing people, right? Which we obviously are not doing. In the case of the West Memphis Three, they wound up doing DNA testing on the scene that they weren't able to do in the early 90s. I mean, none of their DNA was present. So there really wasn't any physical evidence they committed the crime, except that, they were weirdos. But still, even with that and being presented to multiple judges and stuff, and like I say, if you have HBO, you want to follow this case, the documentary series Paradise Lost talks about the whole case. You can see the whole thing and judge for yourself. I think it was a complete miscarriage of justice. After watching it, I mean, you may come to a different conclusion. But even then, the prosecutors, in order to get them out of jail sooner, would only accept what's called an Alford plea from the three, where they admit there is enough evidence to try them for the crime, but at the same time, they assert their innocence. It's kind of a weird, legal gray area. So some people are like, well, see, they pled guilty. Well, they kind of did, and they kind of didn't. And that's why it's kind of a weird area. And again, it's explained in much more detail than I'm going to go into this video in the documentary series if you want to watch it. But that's a point where, but we need to be diligent that this kind of stuff doesn't loop back around again. I mean, so far, we haven't seen any of these conspiracy theories leading to things like, like some of these like daycare trials and these. I mean, hundreds of people went to jail in the late 1980s over the satanic ritual abuse thing. And the satanic ritual abuse thing is nonsense. And so, we occultists, we certainly aren't doing it. And let me also tell you about the elites who are supposed to be into magic. Okay, they're not. Okay, if you go and you find somebody who is, and there are a few very wealthy people who kind of have who have some interest in magic, but like the rest of the population, the vast majority of people who in the population, in finance, everywhere, pretty much thinks magic is bunk, right? It's like it doesn't really do anything. Why would we waste our time with it and stuff like that? And and actually that idea works to our benefit as magicians, because you know what? If we're going into a situation with people who, well, I would never bother with that magic stuff because it's nonsense, right? And we can go ahead, cast a spell, and like make something happen. That's great. Okay, that works to our advantage, except in a couple of key cases. And this is a little bit of a digression, but I want to go into this one too. Where it doesn't work well, okay, is if you threaten people that you're going to use a spell on them. Don't do that. Okay. One of the other discussions I saw online was that, and this is kind of what got me thinking about the sacrifice thing, was there was apparently a story about, like somebody who was writing into an advice column. They had this coworker who was saying they did all these sacrifices just like the elite did, and they cast spells on coworkers to hurt them and stuff like this. And it's like, okay, that is laughable. And here's why it's laughable. A magician who can cast a spell that actually affects someone else never brags about it. If somebody online goes out and says, I'm going to cast a spell on you, do you know what that means? It means that they can't cast a spell on you. Because honestly, if you're in a situation you want to deal with it with magic, you're not going to threaten somebody that you're going to use magic. You're just going to use magic, and you're not going to say anything about it. That's that power of the Sphinx, to keep silence. Because what's going to happen is, well then, assuming that the spell works, what's going to happen is the situation is going to work out to your benefit, and nobody's none the wiser that you did anything with magic, Especially if you were talking about a spell and you made an offering to a spirit or something like that. Okay, well, that just makes you seem even weirder, with some of the conspiracy stuff out there. It's like you absolutely don't do that. You just do it, and then you see what happens. And the reason you do that is in part because as a magician, you're trying to be something resembling a scientist. You want to see if the spell works the way you cast it. And if it doesn't, you want to try a different way to cast it, see if that works. And you want to record your results, and you want to be disciplined about it, and so forth. And, if you threaten someone with a spell and, then you don't know if, well, did your spell work? Or is this some kind of a psychological placebo thing? Okay. If you just cast the spell, you know it's not the placebo thing because your target doesn't know about it. Okay. So, anyway, and the reality is there are not, rich people in the world aren't rich because they're, making sacrifices to spirits. That's just silly. Okay. You can do magic and you can shape your life and you can get to a point where you have a pretty good life where you can be pretty well off. I mean, I'm pretty well off myself and I've used magic to direct my career and stuff like that, for decades. But the thing is that when you get into these upper echelons, you're basically looking at finance, okay? And people in finance don't do magic. People in finance spend all their time thinking about money. They literally don't have time to learn magic. I will say, if somebody in finance is watching this video, though, here's what that means. It means that the financial industry, if you can get away from spending all your time thinking about finances and focus on doing some magic, okay, it means that you can get a huge edge on other people. Now, that's still usually not enough to defeat, the forces of, in transgenerational wealth and all this other kind of stuff that goes with being elite in our society. But it could get you a much better outcome for the same amount of work than what it would get somebody else. And that's really kind of the key. You want to do that, right? Magic should make your life better. And you should make use of this kind of, offering arbitrage when you're working with spirits because it works. So let me just quickly go through a little explanation, demonstration of how you do this. It's actually pretty simple. So what you want to understand first is the idea of the containment structure. Okay, this is an Enochian Sigillum de Amath that I've used. It is not made of wax. It's paper glued over wood. But I have a wax one right here, but I'm not going to take that out for the video. This is what it would look like this, except it's like a yellower color. It's the wax one. And what you do with this is you set this in your temple. In the Enochian system, you set it in the center of the holy table, which is the altar, which is actually what this is right here. And with some other systems like the Lemegetan Goetia, it has a triangle and you place it outside the circle. The Trithemian, drawing spirits into crystals, again, like the Enochian system, it's a different design for the disc, which is the table of art that sits in the center. So I'm going to assume that I'm just doing this the way I normally do it with Sigillum de Amath, this Enochian apparatus. But you don't necessarily need that to do it. The point is, you need to have some kind of a containment structure, this table of art. Okay, and what this is this is essentially like a pocket universe into which you conjure the spirit. Some people can, it's not, you're not imprisoning the spirit, you're not trapping the spirit. You're conjuring an instance of the spirit, and you can look back. I have a video on instance theory if you want to hear me talk more about like math and object-oriented programming and stuff about that. But it's an instance, or it's like a specific point incarnation of the spirit into your magical working. And so you're going to conjure that into this containment structure because you want to be able to control all the elements of your operation. So because of that, during the operation, you don't want to like reach in, put an offering or anything like that. Instead, what you want to do is, I'm just going to show this one. So you want to draw out Sigil of the Spirit. So this is actually, this is for an earth operation. It's traced onto the Camilla of the moon. I use the moon for all my elemental operations. And so this is the moon character from Agrippa, but it's done in green, which is the natural color for the element earth. Okay. And so like a fire one would be like this but red. A water one would be like this but blue. I mean, it would have a different sigil on it. But the character, the lunar character, I keep that constant for my elemental operations. And some people talked about trying to do like a Malkuth 10 by 10 square, but that's not part of the tradition. I don't really think it's necessary. And there are some odd commonalities between the 9-fold square and the 10-fold square anyway that I'm not going to get into in this video. But so you draw this on paper. Okay. Also want to point out, this is not a talisman. Okay. I've had some questions about that on the blog this week. This is the sigil and the character, and you use this for the conjuration. Okay. And so this, after the ritual, this isn't any kind of special empowered anything. You just send the operation off if you want it anchored to yourself, which you can do, or if you want to anchor it to a talisman, you put a talisman with this. I use talismans a lot these days. There's a lot of flexibility. I think I did a video on that too. You can look back on the different advantages of talismans. But okay, so I take this and I'm going to put it right here, center of my table of art. And ideally, you want to set it so it's not overlapping the edges. And so then the next thing I'm going to do is, so I'm going to take a cup, and if I'm going to offer alcohol, I'll put some alcohol in this cup, and I will put that at the beginning before I even start the ritual. So you want to make sure that your offering is in the table of art so your spirit can access it. Because, well, you don't want to be like holding it out here. That's not as good. It's like if the spirit is showing up here, and by the way, that's also when I do the elixir rites, there is actually a sigillum de amethyst below the cup. And so that's what I'm conjuring there. So I'm doing much the same thing. I'm conjuring the angels of the zodiac into the cup, which is in the center of the table of art, which is the sigillum de amethyst in this case. Now, if you want to make some kind of a talisman, well, you need that. You need an object for it. And let me see, what do I have here that would be straightforward? All right, here we go. So you can take like a stone. Okay, this is actually amethyst. Amethyst is more for Jupiter. But let's say that I want to use this as my talisman. Now, another question that came up on the blog. You don't need to draw anything on this talisman if it's the right material. If I'm using this for Jupiter, it's fine. You don't need to do anything with it. You don't need to do anything special to it. But you do need to put it, again, right there on the table of art. So in my table of art, I have, so you can see this, I have the stone, I have the cup, and I have on the table itself. Finally, the other thing that you need in there is that if you're going to work this way and you want to target something other than, if you want to target pretty much anything outside the pocket universe, like let's say you want to cast a spell on another person, you would want to have a picture of that person or some link to that person, set it in there. If you want, and you want to have some kind of a link there to the outside world. So job spell, for example, you could take a copy of your resume and just like fold it up and set it in there. Okay. And then when you send the resume out, the operation will be linked to the resume. That's a simple example to do it. A photograph of another person can be used to link to another person. You can create a link between the talisman and yourself fairly easily. Usually just by name. And then when you pick the talisman up, okay, now it comes into contact with you, and then it works by virtue of, oh, you are the named person in this, so I'm going to work. And the offering should sit there the entire time. You do the spell, and then you want to say, to the angel, just like I do in the Zodiacal rites, angel so-and-so, I offer this to you to nourish and fortify you as you attend to your appointed tasks. And so at that point, the offering has been made to the angel. Now, once you close down your ritual entirely, you can then do something with the offering. So big thing to do, alcohol, don't drink it, okay? You can take it, and I do with like the elixir over here, this cup. You can just set it someplace and allow it to evaporate naturally. Most alcohol evaporates naturally, so it's kind of convenient in that way too. You'll get some like sludge in the bottom of the cup, but you can clean that out pretty easily. The other thing that you can do is you can take your offering someplace outdoors and you can dispose of it, and maybe with a thought, okay, I offer this to you, angel so-and-so, to fortify and nourish you as you attend to your appointed tasks. You can dispose of it at a crossroads. Crossroads are supposed to be especially powerful places for offerings. So that would be another thing that you could do there. And a crossroad could just be like an intersection. I mean, you can just go to like an intersection on the street, and if this is a small amount, which it should be, like I say, you don't need to pour a lot, so it can be a small amount. You could just pour it out, just right at a regular intersection, and that's a crossroads. So there you go. Okay, so but it's important to maintain the integrity of your containment structure when you're doing offerings. So you don't want to be like breaking the containment structure to pour things out and things like that. You want to pour it ahead of time, put it in there, and only then start up the ritual, like in the very beginning of the ritual, like the initial banishing and so forth. And that is pretty much what it takes to make offerings to a spirit. It's, not nearly as difficult as the devil worship movies make it look, oh, well, we've got to kidnap somebody and then like drain their blood. And you don't need to do any of that. It's like, or, I mean, you shouldn't be like, for example, like doing that for a spirit that, well, you just give me some of that rum and I'm good. It's kind of like, why don't you just give the spirit some freaking rum? You know what I'm saying? And again, if you've got a spirit that is demanding some kind of crazy offering, like, well, I'll do that for you. And maybe it's not even like a blood thing. Maybe it's, I'll do that for you if you bring me, an ounce of solid gold and like dedicate that to me. And well, it's like, okay, you're going to go out and spend, $1,500 on an ounce of solid gold. It's like, find an easier spirit. You know what I mean? It's just like you're out in the marketplace. A spirit is you're hiring a consultant to do something for you, basically. And, if a consultant comes at you with, some really, really outrageous rate that's not, anything like what the market bears, you could generally find another consultant. And this is especially true in the modern era, again, where we have access to lists of spirits from all different systems. We have access to all different grimoires. We have access to all kinds of stuff. There's a whole lot of spirits that we can work with. And, finding another spirit with the same power who is perfectly fine working with a shot of rum is not really that hard. So that's the advice I give you. So don't get caught up in the idea that an offering you make to the spirit has to be a sacrifice, or that it has to be something that basically is a lot of hardship to yourself. I mean, no matter what you do when you're doing magic, some of the sacrifice of it is the time that you're spending to do the operation in the first place, the energy that you're building up, in terms of, chi or prana that you use to do the operation, and so on. I mean, you could think of those as sacrifices if you want, but I mean, that's also like saying that, the energy that you expend if you go out jogging, is a sacrifice to jogging or something like that. And, well, that might be literally true. It doesn't really line up with the way most people understand it. So in this case, feel free to be lazy. Okay. Get, get some rum. Okay. Rum is great. Okay. Get some rum, pour it out to the spirit, pour it a little bit. You can have a little shot glass like this and just pour it that much. It really doesn't have to be a lot. And the spirit will like it just the same. So, take advantage of that differential between, between the form that spirits occupy, the form that we occupy. I mean, we're spirits too, but within physical bodies, which has advantages and limitations. One of the advantages is we can work much more easily with material substances. So use that to your advantage when working with spirits. Find spirits that are easy to work with, that don't want a lot of offerings, and that, are friendly to you. I mean, I've talked about this too. It's like you can come at spirits, oh, I'm going to, bind you and do all this hostile stuff. You do that with a spirit, odds are it's going to be hostile back to you. If you come at a spirit in, a friendly, respectful manner and say, well, this is what I want, and I'm offering you this, and they're hostile about it. Again, find another spirit. Finding other spirits is not that difficult. And, once you find a spirit that you work well with, keep working well with them. Keep working with them because, it will keep going well as you continue to work with them, if you treat them in a friendly manner and so forth. And the spirit over time, with repeated offerings, repeated operations. It seems like the spirits, they will do, a better and better job, they like you more. They won't do a very good job if you come at them with threats. What they're going to do is they're going to do something that fulfills the letter of what you want, and that's it. So you need to be very legalistic and careful if you're trying to compel a hostile spirit to do something that you want it to do. And I think that's where a lot of the stories come from of, spirits twisting words around and things like that. And, it's good to be careful regardless, because, magic will tend to take the path of least resistance. And so my structure of using an injunction for your charge and the limitation, that is helpful in terms of defining what you want. But realistically, work with spirits in a friendly manner, make offerings to them. They like offerings, even if it's not necessarily specifically mentioned in the Western tradition. I think that one of the big kind of discoveries or rediscoveries that was made by the traditional grimoire movement was, one of the things that you see in some of the older grimoires is you see things that are offered to the spirits, and that had kind of fallen away in modern parlance, but it's quite effective, and it probably should never have been abandoned, especially when you can get good results with, like I say, you give the spirit a shot of rum and you get a better operation. I mean, that's pretty good, right? So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up for tonight. Again, make an offering to Leaping Laughter Lodge. Click on the donation link in the video, and no amount is too small. Okay. And that directly supports our operations of Leaping Laughter OTO here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the money will be used well, because we're always on the lookout for things that we could do with our lodge space and all that kind of stuff. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for listening. And just remember some of this stuff. If you ever hear somebody going on to you about, oh, they do sacrifices of this or this, well, if that's really something that somebody's doing, they're very misguided. They're doing way more work than they need to do. And probably if they think it's something that works, probably their knowledge and skill isn't really up to par for them to even be particularly effective as magicians. So with that, thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of the evening. Love is the law, love under will.